Recorded at an undisclosed location known only as the Homestead, you've tuned into Ever Vigilant. Our mission? To encourage and challenge men to prepare, defend, and lead at home and in their communities.
The Bible is filled with stories of some rather extraordinary men. Only one of them was perfect. The rest of them led some interesting lives filled with some good decision, some bad decisions. I want to talk about one of these men today who is a great example for us, especially going through a lot of the unknowns that we are going through at this moment in this world as we deal with this coronavirus. A guy who pursued excellence, held himself to a high standard, and continued to persevere under increasingly difficult circumstances. This guy's name is Joseph, and this is the guy who became famous thousands of years later because of his Technicolor Dreamcoat. But Joseph grew up rather spoiled, and I know he was spoiled because he was hated, totally despised by his brothers to the point where they wanted to kill him. You see, there's a backstory to why I believe he was so spoiled. And that's because his father, Jacob, worked for 7 years to marry Rachel. And on his wedding night, he got fooled into marrying her older sister, Leah, and ended up working another 7 years in order to have the right to marry the apple of his eye, Rachel. On top of that, after he and Rachel did get married, 14 years after he had agreed to work for her father, she had difficulty bearing children. So when Joseph was finally born, it had to be a source of immense joy for Jacob. And because of that, I'm sure he was spoiled and treated different from the day he was born. It probably had very little to do with that coat and a whole lot to do with the way his father treated him differently than he did all of his other sons. So his brothers despised him. So Joseph grows up spoiled by his father, and at some point he goes off to travel to go visit his brothers who are off minding their sheep some distance away from where they were living. And as they see him coming in the distance with his bright coat, they come up with a plan to kill him. And the older brother puts a stop to that, knowing that he is responsible as the older brother to not let something like that happen. So unbeknownst to him, they end up selling him into slavery. So Joseph goes from being this spoiled young man who's probably had most everything that he wanted, goes from being that spoiled young man to being a slave. Hard to contrast your life any more than going from being spoiled to being a slave. But Joseph, that's not the end of the story. Joseph holds himself to high standards. He pursues excellence. And he perseveres. And after time in service as a slave, he works his way up to a position of being the head slave, a trusted member of that estate. But he doesn't only get seen and get noticed by his master, by the head of that household who he's serving. He gets noticed by that man's wife as well. And that man's wife kind of takes a liking to Joseph. And Joseph is given a choice. He says no. He holds himself to a higher standard. And because of that choice, she calls out that he's trying to rape me. She grabs onto his shirt sleeve as he runs away. He didn't dawdle, didn't hang around. He ran away. When the master of the home comes back, Joseph's, again, his life is turned completely upside down. He goes from being the head slave and all that could bring to being in a lower position than a slave to being in prison. But again, he holds himself to higher standards. He pursues excellence and he perseveres. And over time, brings himself to a position of running the jail, running this prison that he is incarcerated in. He becomes the right-hand man to the guy managing the prison. Now, that's pretty amazing. Somewhere along the line, as he's working his way up into that position, he interprets some dreams of a couple of other inmates and leaves them with the words as they end up going back. One of them ends up going back to Pharaoh. Don't forget about me. Years pass by, and Pharaoh has a bad dream. He has the dream of the lean cows and the healthy cows, and Pharaoh can't sleep. And this servant of Pharaoh's remembers this guy running this prison from the inside and says, this guy interpreted my dream. Pharaoh, bring him in. I think he could interpret your dream. So now Joseph's world again turned completely upside down. He had worked himself up into a position of helping run this prison, has the perks that go along with it. And now all of a sudden, you are put in a place where you have an audience with Pharaoh. But again, he holds himself to high standards. He pursues excellence and makes things very clear to Pharaoh that I cannot interpret your dream, but the God that I serve can interpret your dream. And he interprets the dream for Pharaoh. Now, once again, risky situation. Could go one way or the other as far as what Pharaoh's going to believe, but Pharaoh believed his interpretation and says there's no man that can do a better job of taking care of these 7 years of plenty to prepare for the 7 years of bad than you. So again, Joseph goes from a place where he had over the years built himself up into a position where he knew to all of a sudden taking on a completely overwhelming responsibility to take care of hundreds of thousands of people through the years of famine that he knew would be coming. My name's Joe Prim. I've been doing this podcast, Ever Vigilant, for several years now. You can go back through the archives, almost have 200 episodes now. If this is your first time listening, hey, glad you're checking it out. If you've been around for a while and haven't listened to some of the past episodes, I have a lot of episodes out there where I interviewed some great men. I've been kind of staying away from that, trying to go down a little bit of a different path recently with doing a solo podcast. Again, pushing myself outside of my comfort zone. But let's get back into what we're talking about here. Perseverance. Like I touched on earlier, we are really at an unknown crossroads right now with the coronavirus, what that's going to bring. We know reality. We cannot believe a lot of the news. We know that they are going to skew things in one direction or another. We know that the governments are doing a balancing act, trying to quell panic, but at the same time inform the public. We know that a lot of these CDC or WHO are probably not dealing with all of the info themselves, because the information coming out of the two first hot zones for this virus with China and with Iran, both of those numbers coming out of those countries are not really believable. So the first country that's really been hit hard, that has some decent numbers that they can really probably work with, is Italy. And what's going on in Italy is really, really rough right now. So we don't really know what we have to look forward to. We know that even if the virus doesn't get too bad, maybe these quarantines, maybe schools being shut down, maybe all these sporting events being shut down helps this virus not to spread. And we avert a lot of bad stuff. We still know that we have economic difficulties coming up. We still know that there will be effects from the drop in the stock market, and also the factories in China have been shut down for an extended period of time. We know and can expect there to be difficulties moving forward. So, what do we need to do? A few things. We need to be confident. We need to live a life of fearlessness. We need to live a life that pursues excellence. And we need to hold ourselves to higher standards. We need to persevere. Persevere doesn't mean that we sit back, take what's coming our way, and go along for the ride. Perseverance means we're actively fighting through the difficulties that are trying to hold us back, hold us down, and conquer us. We need to put the efforts forward to excel in all that we do. I'm hitting on this story about Joseph, but you can go throughout history, and what you will see is that so many of the people that had an impact had difficult histories, had difficult pasts that they had fought through, that they had persevered through in order to get to where they got to a place where they could make an impact on other people's lives. You see, Washington early on had major failures in the Revolutionary War. Somebody like a famous author like Charles Dickens, who had a very difficult childhood in early London as an orphan. We could go on and on about stories like that. So how do we improve our confidence, improve our fearlessness? How do we pursue excellence and holding ourselves to a higher standard? How do we persevere? Well, number one, we have to be willing to take risks. I'm sure there were many more, but just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about the story of Joseph, and he took a risk by holding himself to a higher standard with the master's wife. He said no. He held himself to a higher standard. He took a risk, and it landed him in prison. He also took a risk when he said that he would interpret Pharaoh's dream. Now, he acknowledged that it wasn't him interpreting that dream, but nonetheless, he had the guts to go have an audience with Pharaoh to interpret that dream. He took a risk. We live in a world right now, before coronavirus, and probably after coronavirus, where things are rather simple. We can get into a routine where we are not pushing ourselves, and unless you are willing to create adversity in your life, you cannot become more confident. You will not become fearless. You will not be pursuing excellence, and you are not holding yourself to a higher standard when you're in your comfort zone. So how do we create adversity for ourselves? It can be as simple as getting up earlier in the morning. Could be as simple as going for a run. Could be as simple as reading more books, or saving more money, or spending more time involved in simple everyday activities with your wife or with your kids, things that they want to do, not necessarily things that you want to do, stretching yourself to be what they need you to be, not necessarily what you want to be. It's important that we get out of our comfort zone. You see, in this story, Joseph, not by choice, but got knocked out of his comfort zone time after time, from being the spoiled brother to going to prison, completely knocked out of the comfort zone. from rising to a place of one of the high servants over an entire household to wham, knocked out of his comfort zone and thrown into prison. And again, from prison, from running what was going on in the prison there, to wham, getting knocked out of his comfort zone once again and getting thrown into the humongous responsibility of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people's lives depending on you coordinating and making sure that enough food would be saved up for 7 years of famine that were to come. There's a verse in James that I think really sums up the message that I'm trying to get out. And that's James chapter 1, verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. So Joseph's life had what we would perceive as humans as some major high points and then slammed down into some major low points, and then he built them back up to some major high points and back down to some major low points. But unbeknownst to him, unbeknownst to his brothers who sold him into slavery, unbeknownst to his father who thought that he was dead, there was a plan. There was a plan that none of them could understand, that in the middle of it, none of them could see. And because of the position that Joseph ended up in, because of all those major highs and major lows, the fact that he persevered when he was at the bottom places and held himself to higher standards and pursued excellence and was fearless and confident in his God, because of that perseverance, he went back up to a high point and he got slammed back down, but again, and that brought him to a point where he was able to save his family, where he was able to make sure that the Hebrew people survived through this famine. And I think one of the key points you see this Joseph through these highs and these major lows and highs and major lows, is that he came to a point where his brothers came to him and didn't know him. They didn't recognize him as the second in command of Egypt. And he had the opportunity to strike them down. He had the opportunity to seek retribution for what had happened to him, for those highs and those lows, and those highs and those lows. He had the opportunity for payback. But rather than give those brothers what they deserved, he showed them mercy. And I'm not so sure that maybe after what had happened as being a slave, maybe he wasn't at a point where he could have showed those brothers mercy. Maybe it took all of those highs and all of those lows and all of those highs and all of those lows to get Joseph to a point where he could show them the mercy that they needed in order for that family line to continue. I don't know where you are at in your life, how worried you are about coronavirus, how worried about you are about the economy or about your job or about your children or about your mother, about your father, about your own health. But I will tell you this. We must have an attitude of perseverance. We must push forward. We must not give up. We must not sit back. We must pursue excellence. We must hold ourselves to a higher standard. We must be fearless because God has not given us a spirit of fear. And we must be confident because our confidence is not in ourselves. It is in the one whom we serve. Thank you guys for listening. Big shout out to the Wolf Pack. If you would like to get behind this mission and help push it forward, join the Wolf Pack, patreon.com/evervigilant. You can also help out this podcast by reviewing this podcast, by sharing it with friends and family. Hold fast, and God bless.
For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack.